go ahead and get started now. Welcome to the fifth webinar in the Water in the Native World series. My name is Carletta Chief, and I'm an associate professor and extension specialist in environmental sciences at the University of Arizona. So as an extension specialist, my goal is to bring relevant science to tribal communities in a culturally sensitive way by providing hydrology expertise and working with tribal communities to develop applied science projects. This webinar series that we've had over the course of the last 4 weeks features papers in a special issue in the Journal of Contemporary Water and Education by University Council of Water Resources, UCOWR. And so this webinar series features those papers and focuses on papers that are centered on water challenges facing tribes and indigenous communities, where tribal members, indigenous researchers, and indigenous students are active leaders in those projects. So this special issue is supported by 3 federal grants, the National Science Foundation grant, also entitled Water in the Native World, which was a symposium. And then the second grant is a USDA grant called Enhancing Climate Resiliency and Agriculture on Native Indian Lands. And then the final grant is the Superfund Research Grant at the University of Arizona. Today's seminar is entitled Change Rippling Through Our Waters and Cultures. And it is written by Christine Martin, John Doyle, Jory LaFrance, Myra Left Hand, Sarah Young, Emery 3 Irons, and Margaret J. Eggers. Our last webinar will be next Wednesday, and it'll be by Otakue Karoy Ben, which will be focusing on unregulated and emerging contaminants in tribal waters. This paper that will be featured today by Christine Martin et al. Is focusing on a qualitative research to document traditional knowledge and observations of climate change and how climate change has impacted the water ecosystems, community, and well-being of the Crow tribe in Montana. So Crow tribal elders were interviewed to identify those key impacts. And Martin and others find that cultural, social, economic, and environmental factors are impacting the tribe. And she speaks about how Crow elders describe the steep impact of climate change on their community. But despite those deep impacts, the resiliency of the tribe to maintain their culture and livelihood remains. Climate change is impacting tribes across the United States in unique ways because of their deep connection to the natural environment. And therefore, it's important to have tribal perspectives when we're talking about climate change impacts, especially how it impacts tribal waters. Christine Martin is an enrolled member of the Crow tribe of Montana. She is a qualitative researcher who believes that taking the time to hear our community needs are important today and will bring us thriving communities tomorrow. This is her 4th year at Little Bighorn College doing water quality research from a qualitative standpoint. She specializes in helping others understand their drinking water systems and has expertise in community health behaviors. She loves helping her community and has majored in community health at Montana State University, where she also earned a master's degree. Doing qualitative research projects on climate change in her own community gave Christine the chance to not only document the noted times, but gives others the chance to tell their stories and remember and recall a time when the weather was much different than what we are experiencing today. So Christine will present for about 40 minutes, and we will have 10 minutes for Q&A. At this time, I'll give it over to Christine. Thank you. Ahiahet.
Welcome. Thank you all for joining in on this week's webinar, looking at climate change and just diving into my article. I just give you a little bit of background about about Crow Country, and then what led us into writing this article, and then kind of jump right into the themes that came out of the interviews, and then just wrap it up about the conclusion. And so many of us know that Native American communities are exposed or have a higher rate of exposure to contaminants and just hazardous materials. And this could be leading up into because they do subsistence hunting and gathering. And a lot of their ceremonies involve water or being out in nature. The Apsáalooke community, just giving a little bit of history and through up to how the reservation was formed. Through treaties and congressional acts around 1904, the Crow Reservation became its final size of 2.3 million. This reservation encompasses 3 main mountain ranges, 3 large river valleys, families. They reside along the riverbeds and the creeks and the springs. And then this is where many of their families have always camped, even pre-reservation days. Water has always been an important commodity and a natural resource for the Crow people. It's always been held with high respect. People still live and drink the river water for their ceremonies. And up until the 1960s, people used the river water as their main source of drinking water. And then after the 1960s, a majority of the houses got indoor plumbing. So there was a shift into how people use their drinking water. And then fast forward, we come into the development of the Crow Environmental Health Steering Committee. And this is a group of tribal members who felt like that they needed to do something about preserving the water quality around the reservation. It consists of tribal members, both elders and young, graduate students, people that are just have expertise in water. So, and then in 2005, the steering committee did a risk assessment, and they determined that contaminated water was one of the major risks affecting the Crow people. So that made them focus all their attention on documenting and collecting data and researching the water systems in the Crow Reservation. Then in a couple of their other articles, some of these things came out while talking to elders about how the weather has changed and how some indicators that they have used previous are no longer accurate. And so that kind of made us want to dig deeper and figure out and document this. And so we thought we could compare local knowledge sources with historical projected climate change from weather stations that were located in both Crow Agency and in Hardin. And then just kind of compare both of these to show that what people are saying is really happening with the weather. So going into the article and some of our research approaches, we decided to do a qualitative research design. And so this consisted of creating some research questions that we would go ask the community members, how we recruited our sample. We kind of used selective sampling just because we wanted to target a population which kind of had more expertise in this area. We wanted to do a case study. So we would go and interview the people and then audio record them. We came up with 28 questions that we asked related to noticing weather changes over their lifetime. And this, some of the questions were about the amount of snowfall that they have seen throughout their lifetime, how have the waters changed throughout their lifetime, going into like the mammals and the insects and the bird species, what have they noticed. A lot of it kind of correlated with culture. Some of the things that they did, they no longer do today because of the climate change impacts. And then we just collected, well, we did a thematic analysis of the interviews, and this was done by this steering committee. And then from that, we produced themes, which we kind of, which I go into more later. So starting with the themes, the first one that we that was common in most of the interviews was the traditional indicators that the crows use to predict weather changes, or if the seasonal changes. They kind of looked at the birds, and so a lot of participants talked about how the bird species are decreasing in numbers and how some bird species are leaving and new birds are coming in. People talked about the sage grouse and the prairie chicken and how they can only go to certain places to see these and where they don't share with others because it's such a rare sighting. People talked about how the owls, some new species of owls have come in and some of the old owl species are no longer around. People talked about the leaves falling and how sometimes the leaves would fall later in the season because the winter weather months or the season was coming in later. And that how in the springtime when the snow would melt earlier, the plants would bud and then another snow would come in and then kill those trees or the leaves. And it just kind of changed some of the cycles that were going on in the community. And this is where the one about the moonlight, where they used to use it to predict if a storm was coming in or if a change in the weather pattern were coming in, but then they noticed that it wasn't consistent with what they were seeing afterwards. Another theme that was common was the snowfall, the winter snowfall, which is declining. Participants talked about how when they were younger, during the 70s and 60s and prior to that, that there was high drifts, there was a lot of snow, and that coming back into like the early 2000s and on up into maybe a couple of years ago, where they hardly see any snow, and that the drifts wouldn't even accumulate up to even a foot. And so these were just some of the changes that they noticed during the winter months. People talked about the winter months being milder with their temperature. So people talked about how there was a time when they could predict sub-zero weather and that it was supposed to happen and that it frequently happened, and that again coming back into the 2000s there was less of that, and that people didn't even have to worry about the sub-zero temperature coming in. People talked about the change in winter weather patterns. So there was a time they would talk about when the winter would come right after September, and it would usually last all the way into sometimes April. But then it started declining, and then they noticed that it wasn't as intense as it used to be. And so this kind of came into the part where the snow packed in the mountains, it was either coming sooner or it wasn't coming at all. And even if it did, it wasn't as long as it usually lasts. So those are kind of some of the things that were happening with the winter weather pattern. And then to connect that with the health aspect, because the temperature wasn't getting sub-zero, or there wasn't a lot of snowpack, ice melt, they felt like it wasn't killing the bacteria or the viruses, and that maybe that was kind of what was accumulating, and that there were some times when people got sick more than other times, and they felt like it was contributing from this. I added this just to show that according to the weather station, that the annual snowfall is declining, and that whereas we get into the 2000s, that you can see there is an abundant, or like a minimal of snowfall. There was the time when before spring and right after winter, when the river would start to melt, there would be big chunks of ice, and there would be a time when a society would come out and they would blow it up, the ice chunks. And it was during a certain time every year that they would do this. But as climate change started impacting, we've seen less and less of that. And today, we no longer do that. And the river, it hardly ever freezes up to the point where it's ice all the way across. And so this was just another change in the climate impact that it kind of had on our community. So there were some impacts on the spring floods. So a lot of us know that spring flooding kind of comes in cycles of 10-year, 20-year, 30-year. We feel that because of the climate change that we have seen an increase in flooding. And in our community, the last major flood was in 1978, and it was disastrous to many families. A lot of people lost cattle, livestock, houses. And then fast forward to 2007, that was the next major flood. And so again, it devastated a lot of communities that were, especially by the river. So people had to, some people were cut off from like the main sources of like the town. There's usually only one way in, one way out. So some of the communities were cut off from each other. And then they finally clean up from this flood. And then 4 years later, they get hit by another flood, which is kind of hard on the residents and the elders and the children. There was limited aid. And so with the climate change kind of making the seasons and the river unstable and unpredictable, it was kind of hard on families and on their health, because a lot of them had to move back into the houses that they had to clean up. And so it's just, and then since 2011, we haven't really had another major flood. And sometimes the spring runoff isn't as high as it usually is. Going to the next theme. Or about this, I put in to show that the flood history has been rising and is more frequent, going on from 2007 forward and 2011 forward. Next slide. A lot of participants talked about noticing less rainfall. So there was less rainfall in the April, May months, and then there was really dry during the June, July, August months. Again, this was, so the rainfall, it was like less, and then so this would impact the wildfires during the summer months, and then impact, it would just make the heat more intense. And so this would impact some of the berry picking. People, because of the less rainfall, some berries wouldn't be harvested, or if they were, it would be limited, and then everybody would be competing against it. And so we noticed that sometimes people would say they would go to where they know berries were abundant, or medicinal plants, and then they would go back the next year and they would be gone, or they couldn't find them. And so this kind of had an impact on their cultural beliefs, and kind of how it was kind of lost out through the generations. And so this map just shows that there is declining annual precipitation, and that the snowpack is declining. Mountain springs are an important part of Crow culture, and that they noticed the mountain springs, and people do live by springs. So some of those springs would dry out, and it kind of became a concern. And at the time, they didn't really contribute it to climate change, but eventually talking and it becoming more abundant, people felt like there was less water being formulated in the springs. And so it was just noted that some of the springs aren't being used or drying up. Again, talking about the longer, hotter summers. So we've noticed that the weather, sometimes 80 degrees is about the hottest it gets. It can get up to 89. But during these months or during these years, the 2000s, we noticed that it was extremely hot and that resources and communities were limited. And so it was having a dire effect on the community's health. Elders, people with diabetes, children. We also come from a place where there's limited water recreational activities. And so people would just go to the river to cool off or go into the mountains to cool off. But really that isn't sustainable. And so just the impacts from the longer, hotter summers have had on health, it's kind of dire. And so it kind of has a strain on the clinics and the health hospital. Let's go to the next slide. So this just shows that there are an increased days of exceeding 90 degrees Fahrenheit in our area. This is a projected graph showing that the days are only, our years are only going to get hotter. We also noticed that there was an increase in wildfires. And so prior to 1990, a lot of the wildfires were outside of the area. People would have to fly out and they would be mostly helping other states with their fires. We noticed that after 2005, that there was an increase in fires in Montana. And as the years got closer to 2015, that the fires were even closer to Crow Agency and in the mountains, which is kind of rare because we've never seen this before in our community. And so the impact from the smoke and it being fire all summer months kind of had an impact on the health of the elders and the children, and maybe even increase the asthmatic rates. So people talked a lot about this, and there was a lot of concern about it. Again, talking about the loss of bird species. So people talked about when they were younger, how they noticed the different types of birds and the abundance of them, and how after we did the interview that they kind of noticed that there is no longer the birds that they noticed when they were younger. Again, with the prairie chicken, it used to be very plentiful, but now it is being endangered, and there's projects out there to count them and track them. But the loss of bird species and the introduction of new bird species is kind of a change we noticed coming in with climate change. The loss of plants. So a lot of families, when they were prior to 1970s, a lot of them would go out and they would plant or pick the medicinal plants and bring them back and use them. Again, families couldn't go to where they knew the places were, so they would either stop going or maybe go every other year. When compared, they would go every year with their family. And so I have noticed that a lot of this practicing has been lost, and maybe even the newer generation doesn't know what some of the plants look like. And so this is kind of an effect too on the community. In the end, people talked about having some of the times or ceremonies or just stuff they did with their family, traditional things. They no longer did that. They talked about some of the plants and animals that are disappearing, and it was very concerning to them. They felt like a lot of this should be documented and passed down for future generations, just to keep some of that culture intact. Going to the next slide. So in conclusion, I'm sorry, I would do those. So in the conclusion, we have survived in a place where we've always been, and so that's why we are so quick to notice the changes in our area. And I think when it first started, we didn't know climate change was such a big impact on it. And then after it became such a common word that we do contribute to it. People who practice our subsistence activities and use traditional waters for their ceremonies, they are at higher risk for the impacts of climate change. They are the ones who are facing many challenges because they believe that they still want to practice their culture. And then this research is also important because it gives tribal members a chance to understand the changes that have been going on in their community. A lot of people want to talk about it and discuss it, and then this gives them that venue to do that. And so for this project, there was a lot of people that were part of it. So they had the Environmental Health Steering Committee, and then we had our partners from MSU Bozeman. We wouldn't be able to do any of this if it wasn't for the Little Bighorn College, because they give us the space and the opportunity to do research in the community. We also have some MSU collaborators who are helping us with a lot of our other projects. And then the principal investigator for this one was John Doyle, and myself and Mari Eggers. And so this funding for this project came through the EPA STAR grant. This allowed us to go out and interview people and give them a stipend. And then we were able to analyze it. And so I guess that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Christine, for the excellent presentation. It's great to see research coming out of the Montana. Okay, I'm not sure why my voice is echoing, but I'll try to still moderate. Are there any questions out there from the participants? It's great to see some of your collaborators on the line, including your co-authors, such as Dr. Eggers and Dr. Simmons. So I do see a question from one of the participants, and if they're able to unmute themselves, that would be great if they can ask the question. Joe Gravine.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Yeah, I was just wondering, a question I had was if the environmental program over on the Crow Reservation, if we collected any data on ice thickness on the river.
Collected, what was it?
Thickness of the ice?
Oh, no. No.
Like on the rivers? Yeah, I guess the reason why I asked that question over here, I'm over here in northern Wisconsin, and so we primarily deal with wild rice, and we see a major decline with wild rice in the region. And so a lot of things that you talked about with the snow depth and the ice. So we've seen those same changes going on over here. And so with wild rice, they for it to be part of the germination process, it has got to have some real cold weather, and ice. The thickness of the ice plays a major part in it. And what we're seeing is that loss, the thickness in the ice is declined also along with the snow.
Yeah, no, we haven't researched that aspect of it. We do have researchers, like graduate researchers, that are looking at like the certain like arsenic or stuff like that. But I guess we haven't really thought about the ice or what is in it. And so we have,
that'd be something to. Yeah, I think I imagine you got like salmon and trout in the river there. The ice thickness might will play an important role in keeping that river cooler. So if you're losing, so if you're losing ice thickness, it ain't cooling the river down far enough. I don't know. Maybe I just.
Right.
Thank you, Joe, for that question regarding ice thickness over time on the rivers. And the next question is from Donna House. Donna, would you like to ask your question?
Yat-e. The question I have is, did the elders assist in developing any of the questions for the study?
None of the elders that we interviewed, but the elders that are on the steering committee, yeah, we went through in-depth conversation on them to make sure that when we asked them that it would come across meaningful and right, and that they could understand what we were talking about. A lot of it stems from previous conversations with elders and people in the community. So yeah.
And another question is was there any prediction stories of the future climate?
Not that I can recall.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ahead, Donna. Oh, yeah. Great to see you.
Yes. Talk to you soon.
Thank you. Any other questions for Christine?
Hello, this is Elaine Wilson. I work with the Institute for Tribal Environmental Professionals, and I have a question regarding, so now that the tribe has with your assistance, undertaken this study, is there plans for developing adaptation strategies or a climate change plan to adapt to some of these changes or mitigate some of these changes, or do they already have a plan in place?
There's no plan currently in place, but I know with this research and with just what other tribes have done, I think it could cause or could start the start of that, just the educational part of it and informing people. Because I know people talk about this all the time. It's kind of nice to have something to go along with it, to be like, yes, this is happening, or yes, this is. But as far as it would look like, I don't know that part.
Okay, that would be great. I think that just a plug for ITAP. They do have a climate change program where they do help tribes to develop climate change adaptation plans. So if there's a need, or if any of the tribal environmental staff are needing assistance with that, they can reach out to the ITEP staff in Flagstaff, Arizona for help in developing the plan.
You
Thank
know,
you, Elaine.
I have heard of that. I think I tried to do it one year, but because of my background, I didn't really qualify for it, I felt like, or I was told. But then to be more collaborating with the tribe too is kind of a challenge, but I think if we could get everybody on board, it would be a great tool to create or use, or just to have everybody on the same plate.
Thank you, Elaine, for letting us know again about the great resources at ITEP, the Intertribal Environmental Professionals Climate Adaptation Program. I know that they're having a workshop upcoming and also a conference upcoming. So please check out itep.nau.edu. And if Elaine, if you can also put it in the chat box for the participants, that would be great.
Sure.
Any other questions from the participants online?
Yes, I have a question. My name is Trevor Hare. I work for Watershed Management Group here in Tucson, Arizona. And I'm just wondering if you have any, if the Crow tribe has any youth orientated conservation and restoration programs or job training programs in green jobs. We are starting to build that with underserved communities here in Tucson through the schools and some other government resources, including the Santa Fe District of the Tohono Nation, and are just looking to learn more about what other tribes, what other groups have done out there.
So another project I run is the Guardians of the Living Water. And so that is educating the student youth. Is that on mine? The student youth about just understanding water and its science, Western science and cultural science. And then I have a sister who works at the tribe in the natural resources. And so she's had us, this is her second annual camp, but kind of just gearing more like prepping the students to go out into those fields and being more confident in them. But those are the only two, and I'm sure there's more, but those are probably more like within the schools. So you have like your Gear Up and your other science related clubs. But it's really minimal, really minimal.
Yeah, we're kind of starting from scratch also, but we all realize, and I think everybody on the call today, in the meeting, realizes that the youth is the future in dealing with these issues. So I appreciate your answer, and I'll check out Guardians of the Living Waters. And if any of the participants have any good links or ideas, it's just Watershed Management Group. You can go to our website and get my contact information. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you too.
Trevor, could you place your contact information in the chat box if you haven't already? There's also some other climate change partners I see on the line, such as Bob, Raven. So if you want to chime in, please do. And Gary Morishimo. Any other questions from the participants?
I had a question. That's okay?
Yes, please do.
Hi, Christine. My name is Shay, and a couple weeks ago, I got to spend a couple weeks volunteering with the Crow Northern Cheyenne Hospital. And part of the coronavirus response is it's a small outbreak in Montana. And if you read about the outbreaks in Navajo Nation, a lot of the narrative that was told was water and the dynamic between disease spread and access to water. And I was just there volunteering, not asking questions, not trying to be too inquisitive, but I didn't notice that as a part of the narrative that was being told at the Crow Northern Cheyenne Hospital about why that might be the outbreak. But I thought maybe at Little Bighorn College and with the people you talked to, maybe you heard something different.
About why there is a high outbreak, or?
Yeah, sorry, I did not phrase it as a question. I always hate when people do that too.
No.
when discussing why there's this small outbreak going on, have you heard people seem to think that it's connected to water in any way?
I haven't heard it like connected to water, but I know that having a lack of water, I think it is an issue. But I feel like, again, like people talk about it and then they don't have an assurance to be like, yes, this is what's going on, or yes, this is why you're feeling like this. And so sometimes when the water does go out, it is like, again, people just kind of have to, we should have been planning ahead or thinking about what kind of led us to that. And so with that, there is a lack of sanitation, or there is a lack of people who use water to like, just like in the community, you know, street cleaning, being able to go in a store to use the restroom and wash your hands, being able to go drink water out of a water faucet. You know, there's limited that everywhere. So I think maybe that mixed with the cultural norms of like, because everybody's already has a big family, so there's big families everywhere. The socializing part has to do a lot with it. But I'm not sure if water has a part of like such the high cases. I'm thinking that maybe because there was already high numbers and no testing, and then everyone's like, oh, the testing's coming up. But then the water issue is, I think there's like a lot of aspects to it. And so it could be a piece of it that is contributing to it. But I think I guess if you're not drinking a lot of water, then your immune system's kind of already weak. And then that's what the virus is attacking on. So because maybe a lot of community members have lack of household water, that it could be giving the virus the upper hand.
Interesting. Yeah, I just wanted to hear your perspective on that. Thank you for sharing.
Yep.
Thank you. Any other questions? Andrew said that he recommends getting involved in the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Working Group if you already haven't. And Bob Rabin commented that he thought the presentation was very well and very good, and that it resonated with some of the other findings in other regions.
Carletta?
Oh, there he is. Go ahead, Bob. Looks like you got your mic working.
Yeah, I went onto my iPhone. It's a lot easier. Yeah, I just wanted to echo what you just read. And I think, yeah, there's been a lot of other research done in various areas like the Arctic where comparisons were made with hunters and people that are, you know, living on the land, comparing it to weather observations. And one of the things I think was noticed that those people noted was that the weather seems more unpredictable now, where they could forecast certain types of weather changes based on traditional methods, and that's more difficult now because things are changing so quickly. Just thought I'd mention that.
Yeah, and I think it's important to document that part, right? To be like, yes, this is changing and I think if we don't document that part, then I think it gets lost. And then the part about observation, me and my coworker, John, we always feel that we need to teach the youth and stuff to be more observant of the land around them and take notice into like what's going on and the changes, and then maybe come up with like a hypothesis of like why that's happening and trying to figure stuff out. But we really encourage observation and really noticing the changes around you.
That's
Thank
fantastic.
you, Bob. Christine, I saw that Mari Eggers also put a link into the chat box for the program that you mentioned regarding Guardians of the Living Water. So encourage the participants to check that out. Any other questions out there from the audience? Well, thank you so much for joining, everyone. Please join us for our next webinar, which is next Wednesday, July 15, by Dr. Otakie Conroy-Ben from Arizona State University. I placed the registration link in the chat box, and her talk will be focused on unregulated and emerging contaminants in tribal waters. If you'd like to see the recordings from the past webinars, you can also visit the link and download the issue at utower.org. Again, I want to thank Christine Martin and for her presentation and for her co-authors and collaborators in this excellent paper. I think there needs to be more papers like this related to climate change impacts on tribal lands and tribal waters. Thank you so much for joining. I look forward to seeing you again at the next one.